Thank you so much for coming today. This was an incredibly enlightening workshop that we had on Friday that we're able to bring to you again, so that if you couldn't attend on Friday, I'm so glad that you can be here today. This is Rakima. Rakima is a member of the Employee Assistance Program that we have here at UT, and she's going to talk to all of us about trauma-informed teaching. So I'm going to turn it over to Rakima now.
All right. Hi. So anybody who feels comfortable, feel free to put your cameras on, feel free to unmute. This works well when we have it be interactive. So there'll be some moments where I'll pause us to kind of ask for feedback or thoughts that you have, or times that you've used any of these techniques, or things that you want to try, things that you've run across that have been challenges. It really helps when you share. It helps each other, right, to hear from you. And then also we can kind of troubleshoot some things as we meet today. So I will go ahead and share my screen. All right, so I'm with the EAP. I'm a counselor there. And a little bit about my background. My work there is as a trauma specialist. So I work with all faculty and staff, but a part of the work is around trauma. And so working with the VAN program, Victims Advocate Network, providing information to those volunteers around understanding trauma, and then also working with faculty and staff who are experiencing primary trauma, secondary trauma, or even vicarious trauma. And we'll talk about that today as well.
Diego, come here. Andy, come here.
All right. So what to expect today? So we'll be talking about just defining trauma, identifying signs and symptoms, discussing how trauma impacts learning and performance, ways to help students, and then also ways to care for yourself. That's going to be just as big a part of today's workshop, is talking about ways to care for yourself as you're working with students that might be experiencing trauma. So how are you feeling today? I have a little feelings wheel. So just take a few seconds to look at the wheel and see if any of those feelings align with how you're feeling. It's the beginning of a semester, a very unique semester. So you might be having mixed feelings, several of these different feelings. The feelings might change from hour to minute. So just take a moment to kind of check in with yourself and see how you're feeling today. Yeah, so I see overwhelmed, tired. Yeah. Yeah, I can relate to those. Yeah, so overwhelm's not up there, but I'd say it probably would fall in that yellow zone, right? So excitement and overwhelm can kind of run together depending on what's happening. And so, yeah, I can definitely relate. The beginning of a semester it's a busy time. So we'll talk a little bit about that too, about some ways to regulate. A couple more. Yeah, okay. All right. So thanks for sharing, y'all. Same thing, those feelings might ebb and flow, and we'll talk about those too. All right, so while today is not intended to process traumatic experiences, we will be talking about trauma and challenges that arise when we are working with individuals that are experiencing trauma, or when we are vicariously traumatized by things that are happening in our world, in the news, in our work, and in our personal lives. So those things, we will be talking about trauma, but this isn't intended to be a place where we process specific traumatic events. But I do hope that we can share out about times where, there's been challenges in the classroom, or students that have experienced things out in the field, work related, and we can kind of troubleshoot some of those things. So things to consider: be respectful of other people, and try your best not to, share or discuss any comments, or, if people are sharing that they feel overwhelmed about something, let's keep that here. And then also any personal information. So when you do share, or if you share about something in your work being mindful, what might feel appropriate for you to share today. All right, so what comes to mind, and I'd love for people to unmute and just chime in. So what comes to mind when you hear the word trauma? What words, feelings, ideas, notions come to mind when you hear that?
Being nurses, we usually think about physical, but there's an awful lot of emotional and those kinds of trauma, like the sexual abuse, a lot of the stuff we've talked about in relation to race has been traumatic for everybody. And so that's what I think about.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's cool that you pinpointed, right? This separation between, like, when you think about it from a medical perspective, trauma looks like something physical, but then also kind of incorporating the mental health and the mental component of trauma as well, emotional, physical, psychological, all of those things. So thanks for sharing that. Who else?
As I think about it, this is Danica, it almost always seems negative. I'm trying to think of a potentially positive traumatic experience, and I can't. So negative, something that elucidates or could propagate negative feelings, whether it's sadness, pain, fear, like name it, but it's always negative.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Yeah, so yeah, I mean, thinking about trauma recovery, right? The other side of trauma, when it does become where you can see some of the resilience, but in the moment when a traumatic incident takes place, there's some of those feelings that are feelings of distress. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I think of it as a wound that may or may not heal, just in body, mind, and spirit.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for sharing that. I mean, yeah, definitely, right? There's a wound, and then how we go about recovering from that wound is different for every person. And when we talk about trauma too, another piece, and I'll talk about this a little bit later as well, but what's traumatic for one person is not traumatic for another person, maybe. So we'll talk about that too. Thank you. What else? All right. So we'll keep going. All right. So our current world, some people touched on this. So thanks for foreshadowing this. But yeah, thinking about it in the context of where we are in our world today, when we talk about trauma, again, personal trauma and traumatic stress, those are things that happen to an individual interpersonally, right? That might have happened in childhood or in the context of a family of origin or at school or somewhere else. It happens to them, personally. It's a traumatic experience that they've experienced, right? Then there's this piece that's collective, the collective trauma of the current pandemic that we're experiencing. I don't know about y'all, but this is my first pandemic that I've experienced that's at this level, right? Like, right, I say that because I know for most of us, like, we may have experienced other things, but this is something pretty big. I know I'm from Louisiana, I'm from New Orleans, so we get a lot of hurricanes where, back then. And so that's one of those big world events that happens. It happens typically, though, in a state or maybe two states, right? With this event, it's much different because everybody in the world is experiencing this pandemic right now. So this is a unique experience. There's not a place that we can go to flee the pandemic like we could a hurricane or some other natural disaster. So it's a collective traumatic experience. And while we're all experiencing the pandemic, we're not all experiencing the pandemic the same way. So I always want to give voice to that, right? For some people, right, if we talk about that spectrum of emotions, right, the green zone or like the more positive feelings about something or the more distressing feelings, for some people, the pandemic felt like a time where the pace slowed down for them. It felt like they didn't have that Austin commute, right? So there might have been some things where people found some soothing in the idea of having things switch up a little bit, right? The change in routine. So that's a valid feeling too. Not everybody has felt as distressed by what's happening as maybe some other people, right? So that's one way I want to validate those feelings. On the other end, many people a large amount of people have experienced these distressing feelings related to the pandemic. One of the biggest ones that can go hand in hand with trauma is grief and loss, whether that be a physical loss, right, by death, or whether that be the loss of ideas, plans, goals, hopes, dreams, these significant markers. I know when it started in March. And then I know like the spring is one of those times where there's Mother's Day, Father's Day, graduation, right? Particularly working in higher education, graduation's a big one, right? A lot of your students might have completed a milestone, right? And that might have been a really big thing for them, and not being able to walk. There's a level of grief there. You may have had people in your life that were set to graduate from something or do something during that time, and that looked differently. So the grief, right? Then there's the sadness, the isolation, and just the anxiousness around the unknown, right? So there's been a lot of things that have been up in the air as it relates to this pandemic. So that's one other thing we're experiencing. And then on the other end, there's also the historical and ongoing race-based trauma, right? That someone touched on. I think it was Glenda. And so that's also going, right? So our current world is that we might have people that have experienced their own personal traumas who are now all of us are living during a pandemic. And then we're also having an influx in media around this historical ongoing race-based trauma. So it's not new, it's historical, but we're having more media around it, which then sometimes impacts us vicariously because we're seeing these different images on a regular basis, which can be triggering. So those are the three buckets, right, of where we are in our world right now. Any thoughts or questions about those? Any comments?
One of the things that I think about with the collective related, pandemic related trauma is the anger I feel at people who are not responding appropriately. And I think about that a lot, and I try to figure out how to temper my anger because I can't do anything about it. But I'm appalled at some people who won't wear face coverings and won't stop collectively getting together. And so anyway, that's something that really bothers me.
Yeah, and especially, School of Nursing, right? And thinking about it from a public health perspective and what that looks like, that can really, because you're seeing there's an influx in the hospitals, there's an influx in all these different places and we'll talk about that too. What happens when you or your students, you're feeling burnout and trauma from seeing these things at work, right? And the things that are going on. So definitely anger is a huge part of that. So thanks for bringing that up. What else?
I think I'm having challenges with giving myself any grace, just because through working in the hospital and through what we see in the media, my feeling is it could be worse. It could always be worse. There's lots of terrible things happening to lots of people. And so I'm in this kind of mindset of blowing off the disruptions that I'm experiencing spiritually and otherwise, because it could be worse. We see it all the time.
Yeah, that's a big one. And we'll talk about that idea of self-compassion and like giving ourselves grace, right? In these moments where, like I said, we're not all experiencing things the same. And some people are having more challenges during this time, but just validating that the challenges that each of us are having, they're valid too. So thank you for sharing that. Anybody else?
I think Dr. Acton said it best, and I hadn't really thought about it in that term, but I have been a COVID ICU nurse since March, dealing with patients and their families. And as time has progressed since March, the conversations have also changed a little bit as time has progressed because people are getting tired. But the things that are said to me on a daily basis while I'm on duty by the families or friends of people, I am exhausted and I'm tired, and it makes me angry because I do what I do to help people, and to have them respond the way that they respond about things. I understand that their lives are disrupted, but I don't even know how to verbalize it, but I think angry is definitely part of the emotion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's huge, because when we talk about that, how we are harmed by our work sometimes, even, right? Like there's work that we're pouring ourselves into and we're doing, and then it's impacting us physically and emotionally, right? And because other people are experiencing things, and how that secondary trauma, then the traumatic stress impacts us when we're doing our work. So that's a big part of it. And that's why at the end, and I'll foreshadow this, I do spend some time with everyone here today talking about how to be well and how to take care of yourselves. That's a part of the trauma-informed approach, right? You can't give what you don't have. So we will take some time to talk about that, about how this is impacting y'all as well. And I want to thank everybody for being on today, because this is the beginning of a semester. And so I want to be able to honor your time by also giving you some skills to be able to sustain yourself. So we'll talk about that too. So from the trauma-informed perspective of working with, students, student mental health and well-being, I have worked on the student affairs side of things in a counseling center before. I'm working with EAP. And I've also worked K-12, where I've worked with students and educators providing individual counseling services. And so there's a lot of research around this, and I've seen this firsthand, that for many students, their first entry point into mental health services is when they come to a university campus, or when they, start their college careers. Right now they'll be virtual, but oftentimes that might be the first time they have access to the resource. It's typically a free resource on college campuses where they can talk to a counselor. And then oftentimes, if there was an issue around stigma or family of origin not being open to mental health services related to trauma, anxiety, depression, whatever it may be, this is the time where they have more autonomy. So oftentimes we're seeing that, universities are kind of that entry point. And so again, y'all are getting students that this may be their entry point to getting connected to services. So just keeping that in mind as well. So again, some different types of trauma. So we talked a little bit about this, but a single traumatic event would be an acute trauma. So that's like a one-time thing, something that happened for a limited amount of time. It wasn't ongoing. And then the chronic trauma would be, someone experiencing trauma after trauma after trauma, right? So throughout their life, they've experienced multiple traumatic events. And then complex trauma, again, would mean it's the chronic trauma piece of multiple events of trauma, but then for a long-term exposure. So it's gone on for a while. And then the system-induced trauma kind of goes back to the stuff we talked about around social justice and systemic issues that cause trauma and harm to people. So the past, I talk about the past a lot in my work, not because I think the past defines us, but I think it informs a lot of our behaviors. And once we can gain awareness about how it's impacting us in our present, we can start to kind of make some change. So, when you're meeting with students, you're meeting them now, in the present, but how they show up is impacted by their past a lot of times. And so some questions to consider. And again, these are more rhetorical, right? So just thinking about this in the scheme of your work, how much of, the student's reaction or behavior is tied to something that is actually happening presently? So are they, triggered by something that happened in the past that reminds them, like something reminds them presently of something that's happened before? Is there an actual threat currently, or is it a trigger? And then the same question goes for you, right? How much of your reaction or behavior is tied to something that's actually happening presently? That goes for the context of the pandemic, the historical trauma, any interpersonal things that you may have experienced, but then also how are your students triggering, some of those things for you? Or how are some of these situations out in our world triggering those things? And is it about what's happening currently? Or is it, again, triggering something that happened in the past? So when we think about that, we think about a stress response. Oftentimes, this is where those different emotions kind of come up, and it can be hard to regulate when we've experienced something abnormal. And trauma oftentimes is abnormal, right? Like we're having a normal reaction to something abnormal. This is something that we didn't expect. It's something that we didn't know was going to happen, and it happens, and we're trying to grapple together to deal with it. So our brain has a built-in alarm, and our brain is really working hard to keep us safe, right? And so when we think about this, and y'all probably know this, but our brains have this built-in negativity bias, right? We have to work really hard to get out of that loop and kind of go over to the positive side. But the purpose of that is to keep us safe. So if we can see threat and kind of perceive threat more quickly, right, by going there first, then we can stay safe. It's an evolution thing. So when you think about when you face a threat, the emotional brain, takes over. It can be hard to regulate. The stress becomes traumatic when it overwhelms our stress response system. So when we don't have tools to cope with it, that's when it becomes something that's traumatic. I talked about this earlier that, trauma, there's no like exact science when it comes to this is the thing that's going to traumatize everybody, right? Or that's going to lead to some sort of diagnosis. That's not the case. Everyone's different. And so what may feel triggering or like a traumatic event to one person, it doesn't mean that it feels like that to another person. And that pretty much is based in this stress response and what overwhelms it, and what coping skills you have prior to experiencing something stressful, as well as what kind of community you have around you. So if you have support to help you be resilient when that incident happens. And then again, a range of responses are common. Not everybody's response to something stressful is the same. And then again, whenever we have a trigger, then the alarms set off. And that's what I meant by, is it happening presently? Or was it something from the past that's been triggered to kind of set that stress response alarm off to say, okay, beware, you might need to, protect yourself from something. And then again, the responses can sometimes be misunderstood. And we'll talk about that too, about how they show up and how, again, because something's stressful to one person and isn't stressful to another person, we can kind of cross up those signals and misunderstand some different signs and behaviors. And so how these things impact learning. When our brain's trying to do all that work to keep us safe, it can be hard to regulate. And when we're not regulated, and we're in this hyper arousal mode of trying to just stay safe, whether it's a perceived threat or an actual threat, our bodies can't tell the difference, right? I was once in a training, it was a trauma training, and the facilitator said, there was like a projector over our heads, and the facilitator said, okay, do y'all perceive a threat? And so let's say me, I was like, oh yeah, like it could fall on my head, right? Well, it hadn't fallen yet, and the likelihood of it falling wasn't very high. It was pretty secure, but I perceived that as a possible threat, right? So that's a pretty, concrete example of how it's based in our perception. And so when we're trying to fight off these threats that may not look like threats to other people, it's hard to concentrate. It's hard to memorize or remember different things. It's hard to stay organized, therefore impacting us academically. And then how does it impact us professionally, right? So when we're thinking about the work that y'all are doing, the work that y'all are preparing students to do, really thinking about ways to prep students for the possible triggers that they might encounter in the field. And so this could be a new trauma event, right? Like having a case, they're working somewhere and having a case come in that's particularly traumatizing to see, or someone's experienced some physical trauma that is troubling to the student to see, or it could be a re-traumatization on the job, right? Something they've actually experienced, and now they have someone that they're working with that's experiencing it, right? And so that can bring up a lot of things for them. Any thoughts about this part, about how y'all are conceptualizing and thinking about preparing students for this aspect of their work?
Well, I mean, I can tell you that in our S1 classes, we do a simulation exercise to prepare students for helping patients and families deal with end of life issues. And I think that, like, even before we do the simulation, we prep them that just the simulation maybe trigger some emotional reactions from their past. And we do the simulation to try to almost evoke those so that when they're in practice, they're more prepared to support the families and their patients.
Yeah. So that experiential learning, right? That part that's key, even from the emotional perspective,
Right.
of being prepared to say, okay, when this happens, what are the coping skills I'm going to need to tap into to be able to be present with the families in the moment? And then what do I need to do when I'm out of that room to take care of myself? Because it is hard. Yeah. What else?
Yeah, Adam, your comment made me think, well, the prompt made me think about something, and then your comment. Okay, first thing. So I taught pediatrics, and sometimes I would have students who were also parents, and they had an experience where they had a child who was in the hospital.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it was a chronic illness, maybe it was an acute thing, but they often express concerns about how they will be on the other side and whether they will pour too much of their own sort of a transference. Like they'll be thinking about their child and their experience in the moment. And so I share with them other students' experiences who had that similar concern, and it didn't manifest into something, but that it's something to be very good to be aware of, and that as your faculty will kind of help you walk through that. But Adam, something you made me think about and thinking about end of life, we have a palliative care day, and we talk with students about how everyone's experiences with death is different, and you may find this triggering or not. And some people get concerned when they're not sad about children dying. And so there's that side of things. But I think something that I don't think we've been as mindful about is the meta piece of that, kind of the taking care as the caregiver. So we're focused on them having therapeutic communication and talking with their patients, but like the skills that you learn, the compartmentalization that sometimes has to happen so that you can give the care in the moment, but then how do you bring it back up and process and deal with it? And so we do a little bit of that with some reflections and journaling, but there was a book that our previous care counselor recommended, Trauma Stewardship. Was something that I was like, this would be something good for us to explore kind of with our students alongside, to think about how they care for themselves throughout their nursing career.
Yeah, that's huge, right? And we'll talk about ways that y'all can model that, right, at the end, because that's huge. But the idea of the transference, that's an area where we our fields kind of, have in common. Like as a therapist, like that's a lot of the work that we had to go and be trained in. Like there's no way that you cannot be present in that room. Like you had a whole life before you got into the room. And so we have all these experiences. So it would be unrealistic to think that we're never going to feel triggered, or we're not going to have this idea of this tug around countertransference or transference. And so it's really important to be aware of it, and then also figure out what the plan is to not have our own worldview or biases kind of jump in and impact the care that we give, but then also being authentic to ourselves and saying, man, that one really hurt. Like I got to figure out how to take care of myself after this, or that one hit differently, like it just felt differently. So yeah, that's key. What else? I saw somebody else about to unmute.
Well, we discuss a lot of this at our clinical case conferences with our FNP students, and some of them actually take that elective mindfulness and self-compassion, which is a demand. And and just to be able to establish the boundaries and knowing that there are situations we're not going to be able to fix, but we can help as much as we can. We can try to be as present as possible. But then, we constantly talk about that, remembering the importance of self-care and that secondary compassion.
Absolutely. And validating those feelings, right? Like validating that it will feel tough, right? So that they know that that something's not wrong with them, right? If it feels tough, it's felt tough for all of you, right? Like there's been moments in careers where this happens. Sharon shared, she brought up a situation on Friday just about a student reaching out and sharing that, you know, like, hey, this has come up for me and I could use support, right? And that made me think about this idea of how do we help students, right? And how do y'all help students to not see this feeling triggered or needing additional emotional support in the work doesn't speak to their competence or lack of competence, right? It's really important to figure out how to set up things even in the beginning of a semester so students know that when they're having these challenges, right? Like this can be common, this can come up. We don't want to just stuff it down and then burn out later and not sustain ourselves in the career. You know, I know that y'all's goal is to have them have longevity, right? If they want to have longevity in the field. And so one way to do that is to kind of create this conversation and to have this messaging around, you know, feeling distressed about certain things or having certain things feel triggering is it doesn't speak to your competence, right? So that they understand that they can come to you. And even if, and we'll talk about this too, you might not be the fixer of whatever's happening, but you can connect them with resources and books and literature. And you could even just validate their feelings that, yeah, 20 years ago, I felt this same way, right? Here's some things that I tried, right? So, yeah. So just thinking about that. What else?
This is Sherry in a Rarity, and I'm teaching first year MSN people in advanced patho, and then the AEs who are a little frazzled by the time they get to advanced patho. And what I typically say to them is, if you're not on antidepressants now, you will be in 2 years. And they don't believe me. And then 2 years later, they come and say, you know what? You really can't wish for serotonin. And you know, some of them get it and some of them never get it. But they don't really, I mean, having been to school, college 6 times, you know, the stress levels are there. And there have been semesters where I thought, I am really too stupid to do this work and I need to get some help. And unfortunately for me, I didn't get help then, but I got help later. So that was good.
Yeah, so sharing about resources and getting connected to services, getting connected to mental health support, right? Normalizing the idea that we could be serving people and still need support, right? And I think, again, that's where some of, you know, both of our fields have in common. It's like we're helpers. We want to help people. And sometimes that can be at the detriment of our self, you know, our whole self. And so really normalizing this idea of doing self-care early, doing it regularly. And we'll talk about that too. And just, you know, getting connected to resources. All right. Oh, Christine, did you have something?
Well, I was just thinking, you know, that is so important. I remember hearing this one time from a theologian who had worked with he had worked with folks that had physical disabilities. And I remember him saying, we're just as vulnerable as the people we serve. And I think we forget that.
Yeah. And I think we think about that right on the physical part, right? Like we think about making sure we wash our hands, making sure we do all the things we need to do not to catch something, right? As much as we can. Some of it, you know, can be challenging, but like we make sure that we take our vitamin C. We make sure we do these things to protect our bodies, but the same thing goes for our minds and our well-being too. That's good. Okay. Thank y'all. I love all the sharing. It's really good. So again, thinking about the window of tolerance, I'm not going to read this out, but I'll just share about it. So, you know, when we're feeling hyperaroused, which could be anxious, angry, out of control, overwhelmed, whatever that may be, our bodies try to figure that out and try to sort through that. And so depending on where you are in your life, and again, how much of these experiences you've experienced, how good your coping skills are, how strong your community is, you know, it can shrink your window of tolerance if you don't have those additional supports. And again, this is where we get into the misunderstandings around like different, maybe externalizing behaviors even. And we'll talk about that more too. So when people feel like they are flying off the handle or whatever that may be, and it's like, well, one thing happened, well, it's been a buildup, right? So when your window of tolerance has been shortened over time, of kind of not addressing or dealing with these different stressors or traumatic events, then one thing can trigger it and it can seem like the response is abnormal, right? In some ways, to expand your window of tolerance is to, incorporate regular self-care, to have a community of people that you can lean on for support, to have some good emotional skills in place, to get connected to counseling services, right? There's other ways we can expand this. The window of tolerance doesn't have to stay that way forever. It's not like this sentence, right? Of like, well, this is your window of tolerance. This is all you have. This is just who you are. There are ways to expand that, but we have to put in the effort and the work to do that. So again, how that shows up, right? So there are some people that have internalizing behaviors, and those are going to look like people who are more withdrawn. They appear more withdrawn. They may appear less engaged, in the work that's happening. They may also appear more compliant, like they might be getting everything done and wanting to please, right? And then on the other end, there's some people that are externalizers, and that might look like people who they may appear, and I always say appear, right? Because all of these things, again, are based on our own worldviews and where we are, right? But they may appear more disruptive, to have more outbursts. Their tone may appear a certain way. They may be sending certain emails that could be triggering to you as faculty because they're externalizers, right? They're trying to get all of that out and then sort through it. And so it may show up two different ways. Typically, and I mentioned that I've worked with all ages. I've worked with as a therapist from age 3 all the way up. And, a lot of the examples I give is like when we think about anybody, and when we talk about trauma and traumatic stress, oftentimes the age that we maybe experienced our first, what we perceive as a traumatic event, sometimes if we didn't have resources or get connected to services or get counseling to heal that, sometimes that's developmentally how we respond to stress, right? So chronological age might go out of the window when we've experienced something really stressful. And the way we learned how to cope, when that first incident happened, if we were 5 at that time, our reaction might look, it might not look like our chronological age. And that's a part where the trauma impacts the brain, right? And so, but that's not for everybody, but that's if you haven't had access to resources, didn't have a community to feel supported with, there's a lot of factors that can impact that. And in that moment, the internalizing person may again seem more compliant. They are easier to deal with, right? And oftentimes what I've seen is externalizers get connected to resources a lot quicker. So I talk about both of these because it's important to know, right? We don't want people falling through the cracks, especially when I share that for a lot of students, this is their entry point to mental health services. So it's important, if you can be aware, to provide, give information about resources, give them a phone number to CMHC or somewhere if you need to. But oftentimes externalizers get connected quicker because, again, they may appear more inconvenient, right? This may be, if I'm thinking about little kids, like this is the kid that is having the tantrum. This is the kid that's right. But again, there could be adults that, developmentally are presenting in a way that might not seem like their chronological age. And you might encounter that as well. The internalizers, because of the compliance and this idea of kind of going within and withdrawing, it takes them a little bit longer to get connected. So that's why I shared a little bit about those symptoms of like being withdrawn, not seeming interested. It's just like on our side view and rear view mirrors, like the things in the mirror, are not, they may be closer than they appear, like same thing, like the things in the mirror that you're seeing and that the behaviors you're seeing or the tone that you're seeing, there might be something underneath it, there might not be, right? We don't want to try to investigate every, student that we have, but as much as we can be knowledgeable about this to be able to share resources when we can is helpful. So I'm going to talk about a few of these, but what can you do, right? Providing space, for students that need a moment. I talk to individuals too about like, before you send an email, before you do this, like maybe draft it up, save it to drafts and step away, right? So, having space between the interactions, space between what's going on could be helpful. Predictability typically helps people that are experiencing stress, right? So a trigger for someone could be an assignment that they didn't see on a syllabus, right? And so that happens sometimes, and it's not to say that you don't ever have times where they have to be flexible, but just knowing that sometimes unexpected things can be triggers as well. And then thinking about support, again, knowing about what the resources are on campus so that you can give them information about that. And then also choice. That's one that I talk a lot about, because when you feel like you don't have a lot of control or choice, right? And if you think about trauma, that's one of the times that you're most vulnerable. And so if you have experienced that, or traumatic stress, having choice can be helpful, within reason, right? So if there are choices about assignments or things that, especially with our new virtual world, thinking about how you want to, do you want participation to be based on if someone's camera's on? Do you want, just weighing out what feels equitable, but then also from that trauma-informed lens, that cultural informed lens of like, how do we give credit for different things versus other things, and where you can have choices can be helpful as well. But within reason, right? You have to be comfortable with the choice you gave, right? That's the tricky part when I tell people to, give choices. If you give choices that you don't like both of the choices, then you're going to be dysregulated too. So make sure that you still are in control, in the sense of any choices you give, you feel good about those choices. All right, so validation and calming. So when you do have a student that's distressed, reflecting their feelings, it doesn't mean you have to agree with their feelings. You don't have to like their behavior. You don't have to agree with their behavior, but I know we've all probably been in the boat where we're worked up about something and somebody tells us to calm down. That's like the anti-calm down. Like, that does not work. So really being mindful of that, where, how helpful is it to kind of invalidate the feeling versus just validating the feeling. Doesn't mean you go along with the behavior or whatever is happening that you don't feel is appropriate, but just saying, man, like, you're really upset about this. You feel like this isn't fair. Like, you feel like this is, too much work. You feel overwhelmed. Validating the feeling can really help to de-escalate whatever's happening. And then also consider tone and think about tone. I know we're having to do a lot of things through, email, right? And things are virtual, and we're using chats, and we're doing different things this way. So just being mindful of tone, because that can sometimes be a trigger as well. And vice versa, how students' tone impacts you, right? So being mindful of that as well. And I touched on this, providing alternatives when possible, right? If there are different things that, it's not to say we can avoid all triggers, but if there are times where alternatives are needed, this might be something that you share at the beginning of a semester and just say, hey, if an assignment about, there was a training that I was in, and it talked about just in our world now, just there's lots of things around ancestry and like DNA, and some students are being asked to go through these processes, and they're finding out things about their history that feel really uncomfortable. So that's just an example. I think there was like a high school where that happened, but thinking about if there's alternatives to offerings, assignments, even thinking about field placement, right? Like, as people are getting connected, talk with them about what feels the best, if you can. And then providing information for support. So things to consider. So what's one insight or takeaway that might help you adjust your interactions with students to be more trauma informed? And if y'all have any thoughts, feel free to unmute yourself.
Well, I'm just thinking, like, when the students respond a certain way, instead of just like taking it at face value, be more aware that, there could be a lot more things going on there. So, try to have consideration for it, which I try to do all the time anyway, but I think it's even more intense now with the experiences that we're going through.
Yeah, thank you.
I find that it helps me to use that phrase, help me to understand why, instead of saying why. Same question, way different responses to that question. And sometimes you learn something you wouldn't have learned, because why means questioning your judgment, and help me to understand means I have a problem understanding, so help me, versus you need help. Right?
Yeah, sometimes changing the phrases that we use, right, can kind of like, minimize some of the distress the students having. They'll feel more heard. They'll feel like they have a voice, right? Like, help me to understand, that gives them voice. So that's cool. What else?
Yeah, and I'm thinking that we kind of need to do that self-care for ourselves because I feel under a lot of stress myself personally. So I'm hoping that I'll respond well to the students. I try all the time to do so, but is it a potential that we would be on edge so much that maybe our communication wouldn't be as appropriate as it is normally because of the stress we're under? So I think we have to really do self-care for ourselves, or we could be in kind of some dicey situations in how we respond to people. You know,
Absolutely.
not that we mean to, but you know, it's just a rough time.
Absolutely. That's, and we're going to talk about that for sure, but that's right. Like if we're not regulated, right, there's a such thing as co-regulation, right? And people talk about, oh yeah, self-regulate, self-regulate. We typically are not self-regulating unless we're by ourselves, right? If we're in a space with other people or interacting with other people, it's co-regulation, and we feed off their tone, they feed off of ours, like the stress, like all of those things. So that's, you hit the nail, you know, with that one of like really thinking about ways to be regulated, to have those skills in place because they'll play off of each other. Anybody else?
Well, I don't remember that we said this, but you know, sometimes it helps not just to write the email that you're reacting to maybe what the student said to you, but sometimes it's helpful to bounce it off of one of your colleagues.
Yeah.
Am I missing something here? Is there something I should know? Or what do you think this is saying? Sometimes it's almost like you're getting, it's a co-helping type thing. But
yeah.
I know some of my colleagues and I, we've done that when we just kind of been out of shape by something, and said, what do you think about this? And how have I said this? And, you know, we worked on that, and I've made changes, and my other colleagues have made changes in whatever they intended to say too, that ended up working out better.
Yeah, you know, that idea of like perspective, right? Like in having two perspectives versus just one, and kind of looking at it. And then also that pause, like the time it takes to kind of reach out. I mean, that speaks a lot to you and like your level of like, you know, wanting to be introspective. Like, hey, is there something that I'm, you know, putting off that has gotten this response from a student? Like, what would you say, or how would you do this? Right. So that's that lifelong learning. Right? There's a social, emotional, lifelong learning that takes place. So I love that. Anybody else? All right.
I think your comment just on the externalizers versus internalizers is, I'm going to bring a little bit more awareness of the internalizers in respect to trauma. And like you said, you know, normally externalizers may get more likely to reach out for help or get more support, but I'm going to be more cautious with the students who seem to shake things off and smile and everything's all right. I think there's more internalizers than I've been aware of.
Yeah. Thanks for bringing that, you know, back up, because I think that, you know, you're probably not alone, you know, in that one. I brought it up because I've noticed it over, you know, working as a therapist and seeing that, like, oh man, like I'm getting all the, you know, the students, right? If I worked with little kids like that, there's been a report, they've done this, they've done that, right? But then there's also kids that are experiencing things, or individuals or students or adults, right, that have learned that in order, it's safer to just be quiet about it, right? It's safer to just, you know, it's easier, right, quote unquote, to kind of just figure out a way to coast through it until it kind of builds up. So yeah, that's important. Okay. So here's y'all's stuff, right? So vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue. So, you know, any educator that's working with learners, you know, that are vulnerable to trauma, and especially thinking about nursing, where even if, let's say we've got a person that's never experienced any personal trauma, they're, you know, coasting through life through the pandemic and all this other stuff, and things are going well. And then they enter the workforce, right? They enter the, you know, a field placement, they're doing work, and they're, you know, feeling trauma because of the work they're doing, right? Regardless of that, you know, y'all are susceptible to compassion fatigue. And I know for some of you, you're faculty, but you're also still providing, you know, services and practicing. So, right, there's this piece of really needing to take care of yourself and be mindful for the traumatic stress, the vicarious trauma. And it can take a toll on you physically. Sometimes the physical part we notice first, right? Like we'll notice that and we call that somatic symptoms. And that's the stomach aches, the headaches, I don't want to get out of bed in the morning. I'm exhausted. I'm not really interested in things. I'm not sure if this is a physical thing. Is it allergies, right? It's Austin. Is it cedar or what is it, right? Right. But it's more of this fatigue around things that may be physical, and then mental and then emotional, just feeling overwhelmed and worn out and more jaded in our work, right? Like just having these different things of like even feeling desensitized because you've been bombarded by so much trauma. So remember, you can provide students with resources and not solely take on the role of the fixer. So this is one I want to, make sure I'm spending some time on because I've talked about ways to help, right? Like, what can you do? What can you try? But I find that, it's really well-meaning to think like, okay, I want to like support this student. They're having a really hard time. And that isn't always, you don't have the capacity to do that for every student. You don't have the capacity to do that from semester to semester, right? All the time. There may be some things where you can give quick suggestions and tips, but there may be some students that need more support than you can offer. You can offer within your capacity or within your role. And so, we're well-meaning, we want to do our best, we want to help, but sometimes the best help we can give is getting them connected to resources where that's someone's specific role, right? That's the only thing that they're working with the student on is their mental or physical health. So really remembering that part, right? Like do your best to help, but at a certain point being able to set healthy boundaries with students and get them connected to people whose, again, their sole job is to provide them support. And so how to be well. So I want us to talk about, let me see where I am. Okay. I want us to go here first. So I want us to practice some breathing. And so this is one way of breathing, but I'm going to have us, I want to demonstrate box breathing. Some people say they had heard of it. So I'm not just going to talk about it intellectually. I want us to do it, right? Like I want us to practice that. Y'all got on and shared feeling some overwhelm about the semester. So let's just practice breathing. You have this time now in front of you. So I want us to be practical about the use of this time. So get comfortable. And breathing is important. So we make better decisions when we feel regulated. Our reactions are better when we feel regulated. And we're better regulated when we breathe, right? So if you're holding your breath right now, start breathing, right? I'm guilty of it too. I'll find that I'm doing these shallow breaths throughout the day, like just getting enough air to not pass out, right? But not taking these deep breaths that we need to kind of restore us and replenish us when we are really busy. So, unclench your jaw, get comfortable, and let's just practice breathing. This helps with just regulation. It helps with your stress response, concentration, attention, all sorts of things. So the first thing I want us to do is breathe. So if you can see me, it's hard for me to see everybody, but if you can see me, I'm going to draw a box. And as I draw the box, let's see how we got to get this to go for me to, my camera on my computer is really weird. So as I draw the box, we're going to breathe in when I draw one line. We're going to breathe out when I draw another, same thing, right? So you can follow me. So breathe in, hold, breathe out, hold, breathe in, hold, breathe out, hold. So I drew one box, but y'all can draw as many boxes as you need to, right? And I drew it where you could see me, right? It feels kind of silly sometimes. People are like, why is she doing this box, right? Well, you can draw a box in the air. You can draw a box on your leg, right? Sometimes we need some grounding, like draw a little box while you're in the middle of a Zoom meeting. You can draw it with a pen on your notepad in the middle of a class, right? Just to remind you to breathe. Draw as many boxes as you need. Nobody has to know you're drawing these boxes or doing this, but it's just a nice way to remind yourself to breathe in and out and hold, right? You hold at the corners. So again, to help regulate. So once you remember to breathe, right, you may need to ground yourself, right? There's a lot of things going on. We're having to take classes onto Zoom, right? We're having to do a lot of new things and stretch ourselves professionally. And then also there's the personal piece. I haven't even talked about those of you that might be providing care to a child or a relative, right? And having to provide care while working from home and doing things on Zoom, right? So there's a lot of things that can kind of throw us off. And so we need to come back to center and being grounded to be able to, again, provide, and do our work and do what we need to do and to feel well. So once you've been able to breathe, thinking about grounding yourself. So y'all have probably heard of this one, but we're going to practice it here. And this one's helpful, and I'll practice it with y'all. So identifying 5 things you can see. So right now I can see y'all, well, only a few of you, like on the side of my screen. I can see my laptop. I can see the window. I can see some chapstick that I have here, and I can see my cell phone, right? And then what's 4 things you can hear, right? So each time it's getting a little bit more challenging. So 4 things I can hear myself talking. I can hear y'all when y'all have unmuted and talked. I can hear the air conditioner, like when it goes on and off. And I can hear my neighbor has a dog, and every so often I can hear it bark while I'm doing this presentation. I hope y'all can't hear it. So that's 4 things. 3 things I can touch. I can touch my hair. I can touch my headphones. I can touch my laptop, right? 2 things you can smell. I can smell what I made for lunch, and I can smell my lotion. And then 1 thing you can taste, or what's the last thing you ate. So the last thing I ate was a tuna sandwich. So that's 1. So that's just something, like while I was doing that, I couldn't think about the laundry list of to-do items that I have after this. I had to be present and try to figure out what's 2 things I could smell, right? Like I had to be present in that moment. I couldn't think about the other things that were going on. And it was a way to kind of ground me and recenter me, and I could breathe and just think about the present and not be preoccupied with everything else. So these are 2 little techniques that you can try. I offer these because I know time is a luxury sometimes, especially for educators and getting ready for a semester. So, suggesting something that you do that takes an hour might not be reasonable, but these are things that you could do in a matter of minutes, right? A matter of seconds, right? To kind of ground yourself and be well. And so I'll talk to y'all a little bit more about that as well. And then self-compassion. Self-compassion is vital. You can't have compassion for other people if you don't think you deserve compassion. It can be hard. You might try to feel compassion for other people, but at a certain point, we kind of reach our meter of like compassion. We got to be pouring that back into ourselves. And so 1 thing to consider as you set your intention for this semester and what you want it to look like. I heard somebody talk about giving grace. I'm big on that. I'm working on that myself, right? So really being mindful that how you would talk to, I think about this, think about if you have, a younger sibling or, a mentee or a best friend, like how would you talk to them, right? If they came to you and was like, man, I had 6 things on my to-do list for work today and I couldn't get the Zoom to work. I couldn't get the syllabus uploaded to Canvas. I couldn't get any of it done. Like, what would you say to them? What would you say to them when they've had a hard day? I don't know if you'd be as critical to them as you would yourself. So just being mindful of that inner voice that you have and trying to, pour back some of that compassion to yourself. I see some comments. So I'm going to check the chat. Yeah. So, all right. So I'm going to exit out of that. Yeah, so thinking about that part of self-compassion, right? And how to fill up your cup with that and what that will look like. Okay, so now we need to put this in action, right? So I don't ever, even in my work with individuals, what are you gonna do about this, right? We have this awareness of how to be trauma informed. We have this awareness that we could end up feeling burnt out. The more trauma, our window of tolerance can get smaller and smaller if we don't do X, Y, Z. well, what is XYZ and how are you going to make it happen? So, what's the hardest part about self-care during the semester? If anybody wants to chime in and share.
It's finding the time to do it, because
Yeah.
I always want to do or feel like I need to do everything else before self-care.
Yeah, that's one of the biggest things I hear frequently is
I'll take
time.
care of myself as soon as I finish doing this project or doing all the stuff that's on my list. Then I take care of myself.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And I talk about that too. I'll share a little bit about that too. So time, most of you will say time, right? So how will you be proactive about overcoming the struggle of time? Or whatever you identified. Anything? So I can speak to that one if no one has anything. So what I encourage people to remember is if we look at self-care as something that we need to earn, that's when we get into trouble, right? So if we feel like, oh yeah, I've got to complete all these things before I deserve or have earned self-care, one, we don't want to model that for students, and then we also don't want to do that to ourselves, right? Because you're worth taking care of yourself no matter how productive you've been in a day or a week. Right. So figuring out ways to shift that mindset around, okay, self-care is something that I have to work hard to earn. And if I do all these things, then I could take care of myself on Saturday. That's one of the ways to burn out. Right. So really being mindful of how do we implement this, because we want to prevent burnout. We want to prevent a crisis. And oftentimes if we let everything build up, by the time we do get to do self-care, it doesn't really feel very caring. It's almost like, oh man, I'm so exhausted. I needed this just to have a baseline, right? Just to get back to my baseline. This doesn't even really feel recharging or refreshing. It's just survival mode at this point. So really being mindful about ways to incorporate it and to kind of shift that mindset and that paradigm of like, okay, well, once I finish all of my tasks, then I deserve, to do something for myself. We want to infuse this on the front end and be proactive so that we don't reach that point of burnout. And then what's one thing you'll implement? So if y'all want to share out, you can, but just jot it down. What's one thing that you're going to implement this semester? And my challenge to you is implement something that you can do every day. So I want it to be something short. Anything that's really long, you can also do that. But I want you to identify at least one thing that you can do within 5 minutes a day, whether that be something for your physical body, like get a hula hoop, right? And as you're sitting at your desk, you're like putting the hula hoop around your arm, or a jump rope, or getting up and stretching, doing a 15-minute yoga video, some chair yoga, right? Taking a walk, looking outside the window, right? Getting up and looking at the sun, looking at something other than your laptop. So incorporating something that could be easy and quick that you can do every day. That's physical, even emotional, right? Maybe a journal, maybe, calling up a friend that fills you with joy, like having a 5-minute chat with someone, sending a text message, right? Looking at things that you can do that don't take a long time, that you can do every day that recharge you.
I had shared on Friday, and this is going to be me being accountable. I'm so sorry. Give me 1 second. Sorry, my dog started barking in the middle. I said that I was going to start before I go to bed every night. Think of the one thing that I did that day that was actually for me. And I'm just going to hold myself accountable here, because I went to bed Friday night and I realized as I was laying in bed that I didn't do it. And I was like, I'll start it tomorrow. Saturday came and went the exact same way. And then yesterday I spent 14 hours in the hospital, and that didn't happen either.
Yeah.
I still have yet to do it today, but I am determined to figure out something that is just for me, because this morning I have focused strictly on getting the final touches on for my classes and getting prepared for the dean's presentation, because I had a small moment there, and then what did I need to do to make sure everything was set up here. So I am going to do something before I go to bed tonight that is for me. I'm going to hold myself accountable because I said I would do this.
Yeah, no, that's one of those examples of, right, like things things come up and things happen, right? And I think that's the part where we give ourselves grace. Like, we want to do this, but we also want to make sure that self-care doesn't become another thing on our list that we feel like we let ourselves down on, right? Or like, oh man, I messed up, I didn't do this, right? So we want to be taking care of ourselves, but also giving ourselves grace when, you know, sleep is the thing that we do for self-care that day, right? And then figuring out how to implement that later. So thanks for sharing that. I'm gonna see there's a couple things in chat. Giving grace, you can do it. Yeah, I love that encouragement y'all are sharing with each other. So here we are. Let me see, I'm like skipping all around, get it all back. All right, so for students, here's the resource, right? Like, you're one resource, but you're not the only resource, right? So getting students connected to the CMHC when you feel like they're in distress, they need support outside of, you know, your ability or capacity or role to give them support, and any mental health support, you know, normalizing conversations around this, sharing this in the beginning of a semester with students is helpful so that they feel, you know, comfortable accessing the resources. Let's see, we have, yep, I'm gonna send out a survey for this, and then I can also send this out with the phone numbers and everything too. I'll send it to Sharon. Okay, and then the next thing is y'all. So yeah, getting connected to the EAP. So I'm one of the counselors there. We have other counselors at EAP, and typically our services, we offer 1 to 6 sessions of counseling services. It's confidential. I tell people that we work for the university, but ultimately we work for you. So it's confidential. We're doing everything virtually. So for some people that might have said, you know, time was a big luxury, I don't have time to come over there. I think one of the gifts of this time is that everybody's getting a little bit more comfortable with technology. And so if you are interested in services, you just have to, you know, go from tab to tab and you can start your counseling versus having to drive over to UTA and come to services. This might be a good time to get connected if you've been considering it. And you just, you know, call our line. We're there still 8 to 5, so you can call and schedule, or you can, you know, go to our website and, you know, send us an email. But we're still there. We're still providing services virtually. Yeah, and you get to just come in and have a place for support for yourself that's confidential. And that's it. So I'm gonna stop sharing. And with that, I did this for the last group, but does anyone have any questions?
Thank you.
I don't have any questions because you did a really good job, but thank you a lot. This was very insightful.
Thank you. Great. So if no one has questions or you don't have questions right now, I'm going to send some resources to Sharon. I'm going to also send a survey. And what I want to do, because I am very much, I hope I am a practical person, and I shared with y'all some things to try. I encourage you to take care of yourself. I said all that, right? Like, came out of my mouth and I said it. And so y'all have blocked off from 3 to 4:30 to be here with me. So I want to give you that time back. And I want you to, you know, don't, you know, check your email between now and 4:30. No one's looking for you. They shouldn't be, because you should have blocked your calendar to say that you were busy until 4:30. So do something good for yourself in this time that I'm giving y'all back by ending this early. I do this intentionally, right? Because if you block it, you'll say, oh yeah, I have this thing, and no one else should be looking for you. So do something nice for yourself, get a snack, you know, drink water, take some deep breaths, do something to recharge yourself. The emails will be there, right? You can take 5 minutes to kind of breathe and then get back to this, you know, these tasks that we all signed up to do and we feel passionate about, but we don't want them to break us or burn us out. So Yeah. All right. I'm going to let y'all have some time.
Thank you.
Thank
All right.
you. Thank
All
you.
righty. Bye-bye.
Thank you,
Thanks, y'all.
everybody. And thank you, Rakima, so much for hanging out with us and just talking to myself and my colleagues so very much. It is greatly appreciated.
Thanks,
Yes.
Sharon, too. For you putting
Thank you.